Hello and welcome. Magnus Protocol wrapped up last week, and I've been jonesing for more. There are a lot of topics I still want to talk about with Magnus. We have the alchemy video coming up. I have a theory video that I want to do, and I'd also love to hear your theories. But in the meantime, I wanted to do something a little weird and a little different. I want to talk about why I love horror and some of my favorite examples of horrors, and Magnus is one of those, right? I want to dedicate some time to Magnus in this video, and I will probably use Magnus as the last one that I want to talk about, just because I have the most to say about it, really. But you can skip around to the timestamps if any one of these doesn't interest you. This is by far not all of the horror that I love, and I could very easily do another one of these, but I want to start off with what it is about horror itself that I love before I get into the examples. So without further ado, let's roll the intro. There are a lot of genres that I love. You can probably tell from all the Gundam videos that I love mecha, and I love anime, and I love Gundam in particular, but also super robots and things like that. I love tokusatsu, things like Godzilla and Kamen Rider, Super Sentai, Ultraman, right? I love fantasy and sci-fi, and I've got to stop moving above the mic because that definitely messes with the audio. But I love all of these things. But the genre that I love the most is horror. Horror is one of those genres that just has so much in it. It encapsulates an entire genre, of things, right? Not just the spooky or the scary, but also the things that shake that deep part of your soul. The things that, as Sakamaki Daido says in Sobote Must Be Destroyed, things that shake your brain. That shaking of the brain, the deep unsettling feeling that plunges down to the bottom of your soul, that drops your heart into your stomach, you know, when you're reading or watching or listening to any of these various different forms of horror is absolutely wonderful. It's a thrill that I cannot escape from. I love it when something changes me fundamentally, when it makes me have a different worldview almost than I had before, right? It's not quite that drastic, but the idea that something could drastically change you, were you in that world, were you forced to experience that thing. And I have a very personal, which this whole video is going to be personal, but I have a very personal start to all this that led me down this road. But I had a nightmare many years ago. I was an adult already, but I had a nightmare many years ago of going out to collect the mail. And when I stepped foot onto the road to collect that mail, there was a rider, a pale rider as it were, on a white horse that had no head, and the rider had no face and held a spear in his hand. And there were tendrils of shadow coming off of his waistcoat, right? And I distinctly remember, even though in the middle of the dream I had no idea it wasn't real, right? I distinctly remember the sound of the hooves hitting the road as that rider barreled towards me, spear pointed forward, ready to impale me, right? That has never left me. That is a memory, like a core memory of who I am, that even now I can still hear those hoofbeats. That is what I love about horror. That there are works so seminal, works so special and personal to each and every person, that they become that, right? That they changed them and they anchored themselves to them. And yeah, this is very flowery, right? A lot of people would say this is just me talking about emotions, but I think horror ties into emotions a lot. And so with these examples I want to talk about today, each one of them did that to me. Each one of them anchored themselves within me, and Magnus is one of those. I do want to mention real quick that I won't be talking about Sobote Must Be Destroyed in this video, even though I referenced it earlier, even though for me it is one of those things, because I did a full video on you should read, or you must read, I think I called it, Sobote Must Be Destroyed. Absolutely wonderful series. You should check it out. I also have one of those videos on Magnus Archives, but I don't have Protocol yet. So, it's okay. We can talk about Archives and Protocol. Also, I forgot to say, there will be spoilers in this video. I'm going to do my best not to spoil everything, but I can't talk about some of the things without spoilers, so there will be timestamps if you want to skip past. But a lot of the things I'm talking about can be consumed in less than an hour, so if you want to just go watch it and then come back, you could, but also, you know, just heads up, there will be spoilers. But I want to start off with one that a lot of people have probably heard about, an example of reasons I love horror that is still personal to me, but is not quiet, right? It's one that is gotten pretty famous, and it is The Enigma of Amigara Fault by Junji Ito. I don't know that I have the capability to put into words why The Enigma of Amigara Fault unsettles me so much. I will try, of course, but the idea that one day you're living your life, everything's fine, and then you see on the news they found all these holes in this mountainside, and you see one, and you know without question that's yours. That is your hole. It was made for you. It calls to you. It wants you to enter. And once you do, can't get back out. It's the slow pull of Amigara Fault and of the various tunnels that makes the dread build in the story as the characters one by one give in to the fault. They give in to that call of the unknown, that desperate need to have this thing that was made for them. They can't resist it, no matter how hard they try. Eventually, they all fall to it. And it's so alien and strange, and yet, if you put a cursed book in front of me and told me that it had untold knowledge in it, that it was written just for me, but that if I read it, it would bring untold tragedy, I'd be really tempted to open that book. And so for me, it is like The Enigma of Amigara Fault. It's a very short story, but it perfectly encapsulates for me the draw, the desire for the unknown, that call of the void, as it were, and the inability to resist it. And that is like at the core of horror for me. It is the question of, if you saw yours, could you say no? Could you just leave? You might be able to leave for now. You might be able to leave for 10 years, for 20 years. But eventually, you're going to go back to that hole. And eventually, you're going to crawl inside. Because it was made for you. To me, there is no purer form of horror than The Enigma of Amigara Fault. Just a perfect example of something that could have been avoided but can't really. Right? You convince yourself, I would never fall prey to this. And yet, little by little, draw ever closer. Before you know it, you're crying out, it was made for me! But maybe you want something more atmospheric for your horror. Maybe you don't value the existential dread as much as you value being able to physically see or hear your media. And so you prefer video horror. Well, in that case, I'd like to talk to you about The Oldest View by Kane Pixels, one of the greatest visual representations of horror that I've ever seen, in my opinion. Part of what makes The Oldest View work as well as it does, in my opinion, is the atmosphere. It is so compelling. As you watch the story of a man finding an underground mall, going through many passageways and many different broken doors and things like that to be able to get into this completely desolate mall, right? Or at least it seems that way at first. The atmosphere is incredible as he explores. The Oldest View gives you a ton of time to get settled in and think everything's okay. You're on the edge of your seat because everything doesn't seem okay, right? It seems like at any time something could go wrong, and then it does. And part of why it works, why this thing that wouldn't be scary otherwise works, is because you don't know the rules this world operates on. but you think you do. And every time you think you have a rule figured out, it changes. A lot of people say the oldest view is analog horror. I believe most of it is CG. I don't actually think most of it is analog, though there are great examples of other analog horror. I just don't think this technically counts as analog horror. Regardless, it's still absolutely wonderful. And the first time I watched the oldest view, I was enamored. I was focused in. I have since watched it multiple times. And even though I know what's going to happen, I still can't get enough. Every time the rule changes, every time something happens, I'm just back at that moment again. The first time I saw it move. And I'm back in. I can't escape from this thing. This creature that haunts me from the oldest view. And it shouldn't be scary, but you have no idea what it's going to do when it gets you, and it's coming to get you. It won't stop. And just the terror that the main character feels, and because everything is first person, you feel that POV. You're there in the mall, and there is no escape. The oldest view is absolutely incredible. If you have not yet watched it, I beg you to do so. I've done my best to avoid spoilers. I think I've been vague enough that you'll understand after you've seen it, but it won't spoil it for you if you do. But either way, please go watch the oldest. Absolutely incredible. There'll be a link in the description, just like there'll be a link where you can buy the Enigma of Amigara Fault and all the rest of the stuff that we're talking about. There'll be links in the description as well. But if we're talking about atmosphere, we have to talk about my favorite horror video game, which when I say the name of it, you probably will not immediately say it's horror, but there's definitely the atmosphere of horror, and there is a moment in it that is unmistakably horror. There's a couple moments, but it is Bloodborne. And it might not be the moment you're thinking of that I'm thinking of, but Bloodborne has a mechanic called Insight, and I'm about to spoil how this works. But yet again, if you have not read it, if you have not played it, please do so. I know it can be hard to get a hold of now because it's still console locked, Sony. Anyway, Bloodborne has a mechanic called Insight, and you gain insight from seeing things that reveal the greater truth of the cosmos to you. This can be bosses, this can be other things, and this insight changes the world around you, or so you think at first, right? But in actuality, this insight lets you see the truth of what is going on in the world. One insight, what was once a simple doll is now an NPC, now a person that you can talk to, because it was never just a simple doll. With 10, you can now see different merchants that you couldn't see before. 15, you can now see attacks from enemies that surely they always had, but you just couldn't parse before. You couldn't understand how that attack worked before. And at 40, all across Yharnam, all across the Cathedral Ward, you realize that areas you thought were safe have Amygdala, as the game calls them, hanging on the side of them, watching you. They don't spawn because you have the insight. They were always there. They were always watching. I've done my best in this video to not bring up H.P. Lovecraft. I love a lot of the works of H.P. Lovecraft. I don't have a lot of, respect for the man, but I love a lot of his works. And one of his works is a story called From Beyond. And in that story, Tillinghast makes a machine that allows him to see the entities that are all around us that we cannot see. Bloodborne, I think, captures that super well, because even though later on you can fight a single Amygdala, and it is very tough, even though you can kill 2 Amygdala, there are so many more. And they are always there. You didn't realize they could see you before. You didn't realize that at any point they could fire a beam at you that would just eviscerate you. But they were there. It all comes back on Tillinghast, of course, with the Hounds of Tindalos coming from the corner and the destruction of the machine. Just as in Bloodborne, Insight comes back to hurt you as well. Because now you can see them. You thought you were safe. You thought the world was one way. But in truth, it was a very different beast. And now that you have that knowledge, now that you've seen all that the world has to know of horror, how can you ever be happy again? The next piece of horror that I would like to talk about, the next example of why I love horror, is a very, very short comic by Emily Carroll called His Face All Red. And if you don't go check out anything I've talked about today, please go check out His Face All Red. It's such a short read, but it's so chilling. His Face All Red is the story of two brothers going out to kill a wolf because the wolf has been killing town's animals, right? Herds, sheep, things like that, and the town is at risk. And the reveals from there, this one I have to spoil to talk about. So please, please go read it and come back if you have not. This will ruin some of it, but I have to talk about this to be able to talk about it. His Face All Red is not about two brothers going to kill a wolf. His Face All Red is about two brothers and their encounter with a doppelganger. It's about jealousy. It's about the human element of horror. It is about a younger brother jealous that his older brother has everything, and that when they go back to the village, he knows that that thing that is standing there is not his brother, because he shot his brother. The wonderful art, the wonderful prose that ties together the moment of, I can no longer sleep. As the younger brother realizes that what has come back is not his brother. Of the dark hole and of his brother digging. And all this leads to him going down and going back down to the bottom of the hole to see what it was that they killed. And the story doesn't tell you. The story doesn't tell you if the actual truth of it is that it's a doppelganger on the ground, and they killed the doppelganger in the first place because it had assumed the form of his brother, and his brother is the one that's back in town, or if it's really his brother lying there, his face all red from the blood, and the doppelganger's back in town, and it intends to kill the younger brother because he's the only one that knows. The story doesn't tell you which version it is, and it's brilliant. There's so many theories. There's so many thoughts on this, and I go back to His Face All Red so much, because even though I'm sure Emily Carroll knows the truth, which one it is, or left it open on purpose, which is my assumption, we don't. And so it's a story with so many facets, and every time I read it, a different line of prose gets stuck with me, right? His pretty, pretty wife, his beautiful coat, it was only a wolf. Just all these little lines that it's so, so good. At the heart of it, I think His Face All Red represents best the aspect of horror that is violence. It is brother upon brother, son upon father, man upon man, human upon human, right? And ultimately, it doesn't answer all the questions, because good horror doesn't need to, right? And that leads us to our second of last of the examples that I wanted to give as to why I love horror, The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. The King in Yellow is about a play known as The King in Yellow, that if you watch it or read it or hear it, changes you, it afflicts you, it affects you. I refuse to spoil the entirety of The King in Yellow for you. It is such a wonderful read. In a moment, I'm going to read an excerpt from the first chapter, the first story in the stories of The King in Yellow, Repairer of Reputations. But I also want to mention that as a child, it was reading this story, The King in Yellow, along with some works of H.P. Lovecraft, specifically the music of Eric Zahn, that made me fall in love with horror. And I didn't bring up the music of Eric Zahn here because I think you can do a video like this without just constantly bringing up Lovecraft's work, even though I've mentioned him 3 times now. But the music of Eric Zahn is also a thing that I've talked about in other videos. And if you want to hear my review of either the music of Eric Zahn or The King in Yellow, please let me know, because these are stories that I absolutely adore. Stories that show us that knowledge, much like the Enigma of Amigara Fault, that knowledge can be horror in and of itself. Because once you learn of something, you cannot shed yourself of that knowledge. And once you've heard that music, you cannot go back. And so I want to read this one excerpt from you, or for you, not from you, you didn't give me this, Robert W. Chambers did, but I want to read this for you. And if you want to read this book, you can actually read it on Internet Archive too. So just, there's no excuse not to read this book. But this is from The Repairer of Reputations. During my convalescence, I had bought and read for the first time The King in Yellow. I remember after finishing the first act that it occurred to me that I had better stop. I started up and flung the book into the fireplace. The volume struck the barred grate and fell open on the hearth in the firelight. If I had not caught a glimpse of the opening words in the second act, I should never have finished it. But as I stooped to pick it up, my eyes became riveted to the open page, and with a cry of terror, or perhaps it was of joy, so poignant that I suffered in every nerve, I snatched the thing out of the coals and crept shaking to my bedroom, where I read it and reread it, and wept and laughed and trembled with a horror which at times assails me yet. This is the thing that troubles me. For I cannot forget Carcosa, where black stars hang in the heavens, where the shadows of men's thoughts lengthen in the afternoon, when the twin suns sink into the lake of Hali, and my mind will bear forever the memory of the pallid mask. I pray God will curse the writer, as the writer has cursed the world with this beautiful, stupendous creation, terrible in its simplicity, irresistible in its truth, a world which now trembles before the King in Yellow. And I don't know, man. If that doesn't convince you to read it, I don't know what could. This book is burned into my soul. I love this book. And The King in Yellow is absolutely seminal in my mind. And lastly, I want to talk about a piece of horror media that has reminded me in many ways why I love horror. A piece of horror media that has revitalized, even though it had never left, my love for horror. And that is the Magnus Archives and the Magnus Protocol. And I want specifically to talk about Protocol here, though it does tie into Archives. And if you haven't listened to Archives, you should. But Protocol is the new season, and it's only 30 episodes, and you should go back and listen to the 200 of Archives. And that's the only thing I think of on this list that's going to take you more than a few hours to, like, consume all of it. But it is going to take a while. However, Magnus is special, man. Magnus represents everything I love about horror. And Magnus Protocol especially. It has the human element. It has all of the little pieces of things I've been talking about in all of these other series, right? It has the small group of people in a world they don't understand, surrounded by things they cannot see, that are desperately trying to make sense of it, and everything new they learn draws them closer to the edge of an abyss they cannot come back from. They are hunted by things that will not relent and that will not slow down even in their pursuit of devouring them. And they are trapped because no matter how hard they try, they can't get out. They have to learn more. They are violent and they are vicious, but they are human. and the things that are after them are very much not. It is buildings that lure people in to feast upon them by feeding them to various stores that are within them. It is cracks in the very fragment of reality, right? It is creatures that think themselves above it all, that think themselves special for the things they can do, that don't mind feasting upon others. It is fear. And it is beautiful. The characters and the connections they make, the ways they fight back against the dark, and the fact that often it doesn't matter. It's tragic and it's horrifying. I got this shirt, and I'm going to move the mic back here. I got this shirt because I love what even this little one part of the story represents. The coffins and what's happening there. There is so much. And that's Archives, right? That's not Protocol. But like Protocol, there's so much. And that's not even counting the alchemy and the way that ties in and the fear that comes from that of men who thought themselves more and now are only hurting other people in the process and themselves, of not even knowing who you really are. And really, what's more horrifying than that, right? Trying to make it in a world you don't understand, surrounded by things you can't see, and not even knowing you. It is so wonderful. And I covered all that, which may not really feel like much, without getting into any specific spoilers, right? I love the Magnus Protocol. And even though it's still only done with its first season, even if it was separate from Archives, I think it's found a place in my favorite horror media. I love the cases that come in and how each one of them, while very different, is still tied into this same whole. It's still classified along with the others. And each one brings a different terror. Some of these have made me cringe. Some of these have kept me up at night. It is so good. And it almost feels like they're being made for me, right? Like it harkens back to that primal story, that fear of that nightmare that I told earlier. That could very easily be a case in Protocol. It is absolutely brilliant. And I believe deserves its place among the pantheon of horror. Magnus Protocol is absolutely one of the reasons I love horror. Magnus Archives as well, of course. In my mind, it's really hard to separate the two, but even if we just look at Protocol on its own, it is a brilliant use of horror. From getting into a few more spoilers here, Bonzo, Mowbray, even Needles, right? Ink Soul, and Error. The use of alchemy and the things that people turn into, the restaurant, the Hilltop Center. There are so many terrifying and horrifying things. And often the scariest things are downplayed in them. I will spoil one case here, but there is a case where a man is given a fiddle. The horror of that episode, a violin, sorry. That's the Texan in me. The horror of that episode is not that he got this violin that feasts upon his flesh and blood and that he can feed other people to it, and especially homeless people and students that he doesn't like and anybody he doesn't like. That's horrifying in many ways, right? The true horror comes from how casually it mentions that this man murdered the driver of the coach that he was in. Because the guy didn't trust him when he said it was an accident before. It's in a man being fed to a person-eating mimic coach for the sake of an experiment. The little moments of horror in Protocol that aren't the main focus, that if you're not paying attention, you could just breeze right past, are chilling in the best possible way. I love horror. I love the Magnus Protocol. If I didn't mention a series that you love, tell me in the comment section down below. If I haven't checked it out, I'll add it to my list. If I have checked it out, we'll talk about it and how great it is. If there's some that you've heard me mention here that you want me to go into more detail on, to do a full review on, let me know. Or if you want a sequel to this video, let me know. Coming up soon will be the Alchemy video. I'm planning that for mid-October if everything goes well, but maybe earlier in October if I can get it finished in time. There's a few more things I need to go back over and make sure I have right before I try to record that, and then there's all the editing of it. And I want to do like a big theory video where we talk about theories going into Season 2, but we don't even know yet when Season 2 is. I figure it'll be next year, hopefully January, but I'm afraid it could be closer to like March or April. Hey, Editor Trey here. We actually just got the date during the editing process for this video. It's going to be February, but we will still have the fun in between season stuff that we'll be covering for the first time here on this channel, because we were not in between seasons before with archives. I wasn't covering it live as it was going out, so I'm really excited for that. But anyway, yeah, back to past Trey, who had no idea that it would be February and not January, but at least it's not March of next year. I don't blame them if they need a break. I get it. But anyway, that's all Magnus stuff. I love talking about horror. I love talking about Magnus. I'd love to do this for other genres too, for why I love those genres. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. And until next time, I've been Trey. This has been The Full Spectrum. Remember to always enjoy the full spectrum of horror.